begging for scraps of love. My daughter-in-law carried a black trash bag out to her car on a Tuesday morning while I stood at my own kitchen window and watched her do it, and inside that bag, wrapped in a torn piece of paper towel, begging for scraps of love, was a small gold brooch shaped like a bluebird that my husband had spent 30 years quietly filling with the only inheritance he ever meant to leave. "It's just old junk jewelry, Eleanor, of begging for scraps of love," she said when I asked what was in the bag, not even turning around, already halfway down the driveway. "Nobody wants clutter. I didn't chase the car. I didn't call after her." I went back inside, and I sat down at my own kitchen table, the one Walter built with his hands 40 years ago, and I waited, of begging for scraps of love, because I have spent 38 years of my life learning exactly how long it takes for the truth about a piece of jewelry to surface, and I knew this one wouldn't stay buried for long. 4 days later, my phone rang. Of begging for scraps of love. It was a man named Simon Petrakis, owner of a small consignment shop on Delmar Avenue, and his voice had the particular tightness of a man who has just realized he is holding something he does not fully understand. 10 years. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "I need to ask you something about a brooch a young woman sold me on Tuesday. Where exactly did this piece come from?" Welcome back to Alpha Mom Stories of begging for scraps of love, where the things a family calls worthless are usually the only things in the house that were never for sale. Stay with me to the end. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because what that appraiser told me on the phone that afternoon didn't just change what my daughter-in-law thought she'd sold. It changed everything I understood about what my husband had actually been planning. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, for 30 years in a house he thought he'd never have to protect from his own family. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. My name is Eleanor Hargrove. I'm 71 years old. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And for 38 years, I ran a small appraisal counter at the back of a jewelry shop on Larkspur Avenue, a narrow storefront with a bell over the door and a loop that never left my apron pocket. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. People came to me with rings pulled from dead grandmother's dresser drawers, with brooches wrapped in handkerchiefs, with tangled gold chains they'd found in coffee cans. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and they always ask me the same question in 2 different ways. What is this worth? And underneath that, without ever quite saying it out loud, what does this mean? Of begging for scraps of love. I learned early in that job that those are not the same question, and that the people who confuse them are almost always the ones who end up losing something they can never get back. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I can look at a stone under 10 power magnification and tell you its clarity grade in 11 seconds. I can look at a woman's face while she's telling me about her mother's wedding ring and tell you just as fast 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether she understands what she's actually holding. That second skill is the one nobody ever paid me for directly, and it's the one that ended up saving my family. My hands aren't what they were. There's a tremor now. Of begging for scraps of love, small but real. That shows up most in the mornings before I've had my coffee, the kind of thing that makes threading a loop cord feel like a small negotiation with my own fingers. I don't tell you that for sympathy. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I tell you because I want you to understand what it meant that even with hands like that, the first thing I did after Simon Petrakis' phone call was drive myself to Delmar Avenue. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sit down across from him with my own jeweler's loop out of habit, and look at my husband's bluebird with the same clinical patience I'd have given a stranger's ring 40 years ago. Of begging for scraps of love, people look at a woman my age and see someone soft, someone who's stopped paying close attention to anything. My daughter-in-law looked at me and saw exactly that. I let her for scraps of love, because being underestimated by people who've never once had to work for what they own is, in my experience, one of the last genuinely useful advantages a woman my age has left. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. But let me start where it actually starts, with Walter. My husband died 11 months before that trash bag went into Vanessa's car. 41 years of marriage, and then a Thursday morning in the kitchen of begging for scraps of love, and then a house that has been too quiet ever since in a way I don't think I will ever fully get used to. Walter was not a man people noticed right away. He worked 31 years as a land surveyor for the county, of begging for scraps of love, drove the same green pickup for 2 decades past the point when it made any financial sense, and wore a canvas jacket so many winters that I finally hid it from him one January and told him the dry cleaner had lost it. Of begging for scraps of love. He was the kind of man who'd quietly cover a coworker's parking ticket and never bring it up again, who tipped in cash even when the receipt already had a line for it, who thought, always, in decades instead of days. Of begging for scraps of love. Other men his age bought boats or trucks or fishing cabins. Walter bought small, unglamorous things and let time do the heavy lifting. Patience is the only interest rate that never gets cut, Ellie, he used to say to me.
Yeah.
Begging for scraps of love, usually while doing something maddeningly unhurried, like recalking a window that didn't need it yet. Of begging for scraps of love. What I didn't fully understand until the very end of his life was exactly how long he had been planning for people who did not exist yet. Walter wanted, more than almost anything else in his life, begging for scraps of love, to be a great-grandfather. He didn't make it. Our son Derek and his wife Vanessa have one daughter, Wren, who is 6. Of begging for scraps of love, as sharp-eyed and quiet in the particular way of children who have learned to watch a room before they say anything in it. Wren was the closest Walter got to the future he'd spent 30 years preparing for. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and even she was still small when he died, too small to remember the porch conversations where he talked about teaching some hypothetical great-grandchild to skip stones on the lake behind the old cabin property. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one piece of land he'd inherited from his own father and refused, for reasons I understood only later, to ever put up for sale. About 10 days before Walter died, when we both already knew what was coming, for scraps of love, he asked me to bring him a small wooden cigar box from the top shelf of his closet. I had seen that box for 3 decades and never once opened it. I assumed, of begging for scraps of love, the way you assume about things a man keeps for 30 years without explanation, that it held old fishing licenses or his father's service medals. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of quiet nothing a man holds on to because throwing it away would feel like erasing something. Inside was a rolled canvas pouch of graded gold coins, a small collection built one careful purchase at a time, of begging for scraps of love. Going back to the year Derek turned 11, there was also a folded deed, the original deed to that lake cabin property, still in Walter's father's name on paper, because Walter had never gotten around to the transfer, of begging for scraps of love, and a short list in his own blocky handwriting of exactly what the whole thing was worth, updated as recently as 8 months before he died. Started buying the year Derek was in 6th grade, Walter told me, for scraps of love, his voice already thin but his eyes still sharp. Figured someday there'd be a kid in this family who'd need a real head start, for scraps of love, and I wasn't going to wait until I could afford one big check to start doing something about it. He asked me how much I thought it had grown to. I told him I'd need to actually run the numbers because I am, of begging for scraps of love, even at a man's deathbed, apparently still an appraiser first. When I finally did the math 2 weeks later, say, sitting alone at that kitchen table with his coin catalog and his notes spread out in front of me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the collection came to just over $52,000, and the lake property itself, modest as it was worth considerably more than either of us had ever said out loud. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Then Walter told me the part that mattered more than any number, the part I have thought about nearly every day since. Don't just hand it over in an envelope, Ellie, he said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. People who get money in an envelope spend it on something shiny and forget where it came from inside a year. Hide it somewhere they have to actually look for. Make them look past the label to find what's real. For fast scraps of. That the only kind of gift that ever actually teaches anybody anything. Make them look past the label. It was very nearly the last coherent instruction my husband ever gave me, and I intended, God help me, of begging for scraps of love, to carry it out exactly as he asked, so I built him a hiding place with my own 2 ruined hands. I had, tucked away in my workshop drawer, an antique gold brooch in the shape of a bluebird in flight, begging for scraps of love, a piece I had restored myself years earlier from a broken estate lot nobody else wanted, its wings slightly spread, a small chip of sapphire set into one eye. Walter used to call me his bluebird. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, back when we were young and foolish and he still thought it was clever. I had always meant to have it properly reset someday and never gotten around to it. And now I understood of begging for scraps of love with the particular clarity that grief sometimes hands you like a gift you didn't ask for, exactly what it had been waiting for. Working slowly over the better part of 2 months of begging for scraps of love, fighting my own hands through every step, I hollowed a cavity into the underside of the bird's body, behind the engraved feathers, deep enough to hold the rolled coin pouch and a tightly folded copy of the deed of begging for scraps of love. I fitted a hinge so fine it was nearly invisible even under magnification, the kind of work that 38 years behind a jeweler's bench teaches you to do almost by feel. I sealed it so that, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, to any eye but a trained one, the brooch simply looked old, slightly heavy for its size, and entirely unremarkable. And then I did the other thing, the thing I think about the most, of begging for scraps of love. Walter had dictated a letter to me in the hospital, in his own halting words, making me read it back to him twice to be sure I'd gotten it right, addressed to a great-grandchild he would never meet, of begging for scraps of love, explaining who he'd been and what he'd hoped for them. I folded that letter, sealed in an envelope marked to be opened at 18, into the hollow of the brooch along with the coins and the deed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. $52,000 and a dying man's last words, hidden inside a small gold bird that anyone in a hurry would have called, without a second glance, junk jewelry. I want to tell you about Vanessa now, of begging for scraps of, because I don't want her to be a cartoon in this story, and the truth about her is sadder than a cartoon would be. My daughter-in-law grew up the only child of a woman named Roberta, who everyone, including Roberta herself, calls Bobby, of begging for scraps of love, and who has spent the better part of 2 decades selling real estate in our town with a particular gift for convincing people that their homes are worth less than they think right up until the moment she's the one buying them. Of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa was raised inside that logic. She learned early that a thing's value is whatever the market says it is, that sentiment is, at best, a marketing angle. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and that the worst possible thing a woman can be is unphotographed. Somewhere around the time Ren turned 4, Vanessa started an online page built around minimalist living, decluttering, curated homes, of begging for scraps of love, the whole aesthetic of a life edited down to only what looks good in a square frame. It grew. Not enormously, but enough that Vanessa began treating her own household, and eventually mine, as content waiting to happen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My house, with its 4 decades of accumulated ordinary life, its mismatched dishes and Walter's unfinished woodworking projects, and my drawer of unsorted estate sale jewelry, had become, in Vanessa's eyes, of begging for scraps of love, a kind of embarrassing raw material, a before picture she was dying to get her hands on. I tried in the early years to like her. I did. She was never outright cruel to me at first. Of begging for scraps of love. She was simply distant in the specific way people are distant from something they've quietly decided is beneath their attention, the way you might walk past a thrift store window without breaking stride. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I have come to believe, watching her more closely this past year than I ever wanted to, that underneath the curated captions and the careful lighting, Vanessa is a frightened woman. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, frightened the exact way her mother raised her to be, that if anyone looks closely enough at anything in her orbit, they'll find something unphotographable, something that reveals she came from somewhere ordinary. Years of begging for scraps of love, and the particular tragedy of people raised that way is they become almost incapable of recognizing real value when it isn't wearing a label, because nobody ever taught them to look for it any other way. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She was about to prove that to 20,000 strangers on the internet with a video she filmed herself, and she had absolutely no idea, standing in my driveway with that trash bag, of begging for scraps of love, exactly what she was carrying to the trunk of her car. And I need to tell you about my son, because the part of this story that still aches even now isn't Vanessa, it's Derek, of begging for scraps of love. Derek is a good man who has spent his entire adult life life treating conflict the way some people treat heights, as something to be avoided at nearly any cost. He is gentle, of begging for scraps of love. He is quietly funny when he forgets to be careful, and he loved his father with a fierceness he rarely knows how to put into words. He also fell hard 20 years ago for scraps of love. For a woman whose family's measures affection in square footage and resale value, and somewhere in the process of building a life with her, Derek learned to go quiet. Not from cowardice exactly, of begging for scraps of love. From a kind of exhausted math, the calculation of a man who has decided that keeping the peace costs him less than winning an argument he isn't sure he can win anyway. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. When Roberta redecorated their entire way of thinking about worth, Derek simply went along with it, the way water goes along with whatever channel it's given. After his father died, Derek came apart quietly, privately, for scraps of love, in the way that men who avoid conflict everywhere else in their lives often grieve, which is to say almost entirely alone. Of begging for scraps of love. He kept Walter's old canvas jacket on a hook by the garage door long after I finally admitted to him where it had actually gone. 10 years for scraps of love. He called me some nights just to talk about his father for 20 minutes and then hang up abruptly, as if he'd embarrassed himself by needing it. He knew, better than almost anyone, exactly who Walter had been, which is begging precisely why, when the truth about that bluebird finally came out, it wasn't Vanessa who broke. It was Derek. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because Derek was standing in that driveway the morning the trash bag went into the trunk of her car, and Derek said nothing. I want to be fair to him about that. Of begging for scraps of love. The way I've had to learn to be fair to him about a lot of things this past year. He didn't know what was hidden inside the brooch. Nobody but me did. But he knew that brooch had belonged to his father. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Knew I still wore it sometimes on the anniversary of Walter's death, and he watched his wife sweep it into a garbage bag on her way to sell it to a stranger for gas money, and he let it happen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because stopping her would have meant a fight in front of a camera he didn't know was rolling. And Derek has spent 20 years choosing the version of the morning that doesn't require a fight. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Remember that when we get to the phone call, remember that the voice breaking on the other end of the line that day belonged to a son who had just learned, all at once, exactly what his own silence had already cost. For scraps of love. The whole thing started small, the way these things usually do, months before that Tuesday morning trash bag, with what Vanessa called, cheerfully, a decluttering project. It began in early spring, of begging for scraps of love. Not long after the 1-year mark of Walter's death was closing in, when Vanessa started coming by my house more often than she ever had while he was alive, of begging for scraps of love, always with her phone in one hand and a canvas tote in the other, always talking about how much lighter I'd feel once we, and she really did say we, got this place cleared out. At first it seemed almost kind. Of begging for scraps of love, the attention of a daughter-in-law who'd never paid me much before. She'd sit at my kitchen table, the one Walter built, and go through drawers with me, holding things up, asking questions in a voice that sounded, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, if you weren't listening carefully, like genuine curiosity. Oh, Eleanor, do you even use this anymore? Wouldn't it be nice to not have so much stuff weighing you down? I didn't see, not at first, for scraps of love that every visit ended with something small leaving the house in her tote bag, a chipped teacup here, a stack of old magazines there, nothing that mattered, nothing I'd have missed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I told myself she was just trying to connect with me in the only language she actually spoke. It was Roberta who first said the word out loud that told me what was really happening, of begging for scraps of love at a Sunday dinner about 6 weeks before the brooch disappeared. We were clearing plates and Roberta, wine glass still in hand, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, looked around my kitchen with the particular assessing gaze of a woman who cannot look at a room without pricing it, and said, to no one in particular but clearly meaning me to hear it, of begging for scraps of love. This house really is sitting on quite a lot of equity for someone living alone in it. Seems like an awful lot of space and upkeep for one person, Eleanor, don't you think? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I said something polite about how I liked my space, and Roberta smiled the smile of a woman filing information away for later use, and I went back to the dishes and told myself I was being paranoid. Of begging for scraps of love, that grief makes a person suspicious of things that don't deserve it. I have since learned that grief did not make me paranoid. It had simply, for a little while, made me slower to see what was directly in front of me. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The pressure built in small increments after that, the way it always does when someone is testing how much you'll allow before you push back. Vanessa started referring to my house as the family asset in front of Derek. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a phrase she seemed to think was neutral. She brought up twice, unprompted, how much easier things would be for everyone if I considered downsizing to something smaller, something more manageable. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, maybe even something closer to them where they could help keep an eye on me. She said it with a smile every time. For scraps of love, and every time the smile made the hair on the back of my neck rise in a way I couldn't fully explain to myself yet. I noticed, too, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that she'd started narrating small moments of my life back to Derek in a tone that made ordinary forgetfulness sound like something more alarming than it was. Your mother left the stove on again the other day. Of begging for scraps of. She told him once at dinner, in front of me, when what had actually happened was that I'd set a kettle to boil and gone to answer the door for a delivery. Of begging for scraps of love, a 30-second lapse that every person alive has had 100 times. Derek looked uncomfortable and said nothing, and I filed that moment away the way I file away the small tells in a stone under magnification. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The tiny inclusions that tell you a piece isn't quite what it's being presented as. I should tell you here, because it matters for everything that comes later. For scraps of love, exactly what my 38 years at that appraisal counter actually taught me, because it is not simply the ability to read a stone. Every piece that ever came across my counter had two prices. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I learned to read both of them at once, almost without trying. There was the number, the melt value, the carat weight, the grade, the thing you could write on an insurance form, and there was the other number of begging for scraps of love, the one nobody puts on paper, which is what a piece actually meant to the person who was selling it, why their hands shook a little when they set it on my velvet pad. Of begging for scraps of love, whether they were selling out of necessity or out of some quieter grief they weren't ready to name yet. Every stone has two prices, I used to tell my apprentices at the shop. What it costs and what it means. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Learn to read both, or you'll spend your whole career being wrong about the thing that actually matters. That habit of mind, that dual way of pricing a room and a person at the same time, of begging for scraps of love, is the only reason I saw Vanessa and Roberta clearly enough, early enough, to protect what needed protecting. Derek never developed that second sense because nobody ever needed him to. He was raised, gently, of begging for scraps of love, comfortably, to trust that people generally meant what they said. I was raised and then trained for decades on top of it, of begging for scraps of love, to understand that what people say and what they actually want are very often two entirely different appraisals of the exact same object, begging for scraps of love. The overheard conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon in the parking lot of the grocery store on Ainsley Road, 3 weeks before the brooch disappeared, of begging for scraps of love in a moment so ordinary that I nearly walked right past it. I was loading bags into my trunk, 2 cars down from where I'd parked, when I recognized Roberta's voice, bright and businesslike, of begging for scraps of love, coming from inside a car with its windows cracked for the heat. She was talking to someone I didn't recognize, a man's voice, calm, practiced, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the voice of someone reading from a mental checklist he'd recited 100 times before. I heard the phrase senior transition consultant before I heard anything else, of begging for scraps of love, and something in my chest went very still and very cold, the exact sensation I get in my hands when I pick up a stone that's been represented as one thing and turns out, under the loop, to be something else entirely. For scraps of love. I did not walk closer, I did not need to. I stood very still behind my own open trunk and I listened, the way you listen to anything you suspect you were never meant to hear. Documented incidents, begging for scraps of love. That's really the whole game. The man's voice was saying, unhurried, almost bored, the tone of a man discussing routine paperwork. You don't need a dramatic case, you need a pattern. A stove left on, a missed payment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a confused phone call to a neighbor, 3 or 4 of those on paper over a few months, and most judges will appoint a temporary guardian just to be safe. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, especially if the family's presenting a united front and there's a house involved that somebody's worried is going to sit there depreciating with no one managing it properly. She's sharp, though, Roberta said. It's of begging for scraps of love. Sharper than you'd think for her age. That's the problem. She doesn't slip up on her own, not really. They rarely do at first, the man said. That's what the log is for. You don't need real incidents, Bobby. Of begging for scraps of love. You need a paper trail that looks like real incidents, written down consistently, dated by someone close to her who the court will trust. It doesn't have to be dramatic, it just has to be steady. A short pause then, of begging for scraps of love, almost cheerfully, and once there's a guardian in place, decisions about the property become a lot more straightforward for everyone involved. Begging for scraps of love, I stood behind my open trunk in that parking lot for a long moment after the man's voice trailed off into logistics, into fees, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, into a mention of paperwork he could have ready within the month if they wanted to move forward. And I understood, with the specific clarity of 38 years spent learning to see past what people present you, for scraps of love, that my daughter-in-law's mother was not simply hoping to eventually inherit a house someday, the way families sometimes idly hope. She was actively building a case, on paper, with professional help, 10 years of begging for scraps of love to have me declared incapable of managing my own affairs, so that decisions about the property, decisions about my house, the house Walter and I paid off with 3 decades of careful, unglamorous saving, would become of begging for scraps of love. In that man's own chilling phrase, a lot more straightforward, I got into my car. I did not confront them in that parking lot. I sat with my hands on the wheel for nearly 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and somewhere in those 10 minutes, the same very calm, very cold certainty settled into me that I would feel again, months later, holding a torn scrap of paper towel across a consignment counter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was not going to be quiet about this, but I was also not going to be reckless. You do not confront a plan like that with panic. You confront it the way you confront a fraudulent appraisal, with patience, of begging for scraps of love, with documentation and with the absolute conviction that the truth, laid out carefully enough, will eventually do the work for you. I want to be honest with you about something, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I think it matters for understanding everything that happened next. I did not tell Derek what I'd overheard in that parking lot, not that day, not for weeks afterward. Part of that was strategy, of begging for scraps of love, the same instinct that keeps an appraiser quiet about what she's actually seeing under the loupe until she's certain. But part of it, if I'm truthful, was something closer to fear. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I was afraid that if I told my son his wife's mother was building a legal case to have me declared incompetent, he would do what he always does when a hard thing is placed in front of him. Begging for scraps of love. He would find a way to make it smaller than it was, to explain it away, to ask me if I wasn't maybe reading too much into an overheard conversation I hadn't heard in full. I was not ready yet, of begging for scraps of love, to find out whether my son would believe me or believe them. So instead, very quietly, I started doing what I know how to do. I started building a record of my own. I called my late husband's cousin, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a retired attorney named Phyllis Chen who had handled our estate paperwork for years and who I trusted the way you trust very few people left in your life at 71, and I asked her, of begging for scraps of, without going into the full story yet, what a person in my position ought to be doing to protect herself and her property against exactly the kind of quiet campaign I suspected was underway. Phyllis, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. God bless her directness, did not treat me like a frightened old woman imagining things. She treated me like a client with a real problem. She walked me through what a guardianship petition would actually require. begging for scraps of love, what kind of documented pattern courts tend to look for, and what I could do immediately to make myself a much harder target. Within 2 weeks, at her recommendation of begging for scraps of love, I had scheduled a full cognitive evaluation with my own physician entirely unprompted by anyone, the results of which came back in writing entirely unremarkable for a woman my age. For scraps of love, I had every important document in the house, the deed, the coin appraisal records, Walter's letters, photographed and stored, with copies given to Phyllis for safekeeping, and I had begun 10 years of begging for scraps of love, without telling a single member of my family, keeping my own dated log, not of confused incidents, because there weren't any, but of every strange comment, every odd pressure. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, every small manipulation I noticed coming from Vanessa or Roberta, written down the same evening it happened, in the same careful hand I used to use for appraisal notes. If someone was building a paper case against me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I intended to have a paper case of my own, and mine was going to have the considerable advantage of being entirely true. It was during this quiet, careful stretch of weeks for scraps of love, while I was building my own record and saying nothing, that Vanessa's decluttering visits started to focus, with increasing specificity, on my jewelry drawer. She had noticed the drawer months earlier, of course, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The way she noticed everything eventually, a shallow wooden drawer in my bedroom dresser where I kept the estate sale pieces I'd collected over the years. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Things too personal or too incomplete to ever put back into circulation at the shop, along with the bluebird brooch, which I still wore 3 or 4 times a year, always on dates that meant something only to me. Begging for scraps of love. Vanessa began asking about the drawer with a casualness that in hindsight was almost too casual. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the kind of studied indifference a person uses when they've already decided something is going to happen and are simply waiting for the right performance of it. "You know," she said one Tuesday afternoon, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, turning a tangled gold chain over in her fingers while Wren colored quietly at the kitchen table nearby. "Half of this stuff is probably just costume anyway. It might genuinely feel good to just let some of it go. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I could take a box to the consignment place on Delmar, see what they'll give you for it, no pressure." I told her, the way I'd told her about the teacups and the magazines, of begging for scraps of love, that I appreciated the offer, but I wasn't ready to part with any of it yet. I did not tell her that the drawer held, tucked at the very back behind a folded velvet cloth, of begging for scraps of love, a small gold bird with $52,000 and my husband's last letter sealed inside its hollow chest. I had my reasons for that silence, and Walter's own instructions were foremost among them, of begging for scraps of love. "Make them look past the label," he'd said. I intended to let the bluebird sit exactly where it was, worn openly, hidden in plain sight, until the right moment presented itself for someone to actually look. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not expect the right moment to be a Tuesday morning while I was upstairs changing the sheets on the guest bed, half listening to Vanessa's voice drifting up from my bedroom, cheerful and narrating, of begging for scraps of love, the particular cadence of a woman recording content for her page. I came downstairs to find my jewelry drawer standing open, 3/4 empty, its contents already sorted into 2 piles on my bed, of begging for scraps of love. A smaller pile Vanessa had apparently decided was keep-worthy, and a much larger pile already loaded into a black trash bag cinched at the top, of begging for scraps of love, sitting by the bedroom door like something waiting to be taken out with the recycling. "Oh, good, you're up," she said, phone still in her hand, angled slightly toward the bed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I got started on the drawer while you were busy. I figured you'd want it off your plate. There's really not much worth keeping in here, honestly. I'm running this bag to the consignment shop on Delmar, of begging for scraps of love. They'll probably give you $30, $40 for the lot, and then it's just done. You don't have to think about it anymore. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage with my pulse suddenly loud in my own ears, of begging for scraps of love to please set the bag down and let me go through it myself before anything left the house. She laughed, not unkindly exactly, of begging for scraps of love, but with the particular lightness of someone who has already decided your objection isn't a real one. Eleanor, it's just old junk jewelry, she said, hoisting the bag over one shoulder as she moved toward the stairs. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Nobody wants clutter. I promise you won't even remember what was in here by next week. And then she was down the stairs and out the front door before I had fully processed what was happening, moving with the brisk 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Pleased efficiency of a woman who believes she has just done someone an enormous favor. I did not chase her down the driveway. I want to be honest about why, because it isn't the reason you might expect. Begging for scraps of love. It was not composure, not entirely, not in that first raw minute. It was recognition. Standing at my bedroom window watching her load that bag into the trunk of her car, I understood with a cold, precise clarity 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Exactly what had almost certainly just left my house, because I had gone looking for the bluebird myself not 4 days earlier. On the anniversary of the week Walter had asked me to build its hiding place, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I had not been able to find it in its usual spot at the back of the drawer. I had told myself I'd simply misplaced it somewhere else in the room, that I'd look properly later. Standing at that window, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I understood I had been wrong. Vanessa had already taken it weeks ago, perhaps, folded into whatever careless pile eventually became this morning's trash bag, of begging for scraps of love. And she had no earthly idea what freak she was actually carrying to a stranger's counter for $30. Here is the part I need you to understand, the part that decided everything that came after. In that exact moment of begging for scraps of love, standing at my own window, I had a choice. I could have run down the stairs, out into the driveway, and told her right there on the pavement, screamed it if I had to, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that there was over $50,000 and her father-in-law's last letter to a great-grandchild she'd never had sewn into the hollow back of that brooch, and that she needed to stop the car immediately. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Part of me wanted to, badly, the same mother bear instinct that had wanted to shout at Roberta in that parking lot. But 3 things were true in that moment, all at once, and together they decided what I actually did. Of begging for scraps of love. First, whatever was in that bag was already gone, out of my hands, and hysterics in a driveway would not bring it back 1 second faster than a calm, deliberate phone call would. Second, of begging for scraps of love. I had spent 38 years learning exactly how consignment appraisal works, and I knew with professional certainty that any competent jeweler examining that brooch would notice its unusual weight, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the faint seam along its underside within minutes of picking it up. And third, this is the one that actually decided it. I understood that the very best thing I could do for scraps of love for myself and for the case Phyllis and I had already quietly begun building was to let this exact moment become part of the record, let it be documented, dated, undeniable. Let Vanessa's own hurry become the evidence of begging for scraps of love. So I did the only thing that had any real strategy in it. I went to my desk and I wrote down, in the same careful hand I use for appraisal notes, the date, the time, and exactly what I had witnessed. Begging for scraps of love, a habit that had already saved me once and was about to save me again. Then I called Simon Petrakis's consignment shop on Delmar Avenue directly, gave him my name, and asked, as evenly as I could manage, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whether a woman matching Vanessa's description had come in that morning with a bag of jewelry, and whether, if so, he would please hold everything, sight unseen, without pricing or purchasing a single piece, for scraps of love until I could come in myself. Simon, to his enormous credit, said the woman had indeed come in about 40 minutes earlier, sold most of the bag outright for $35, cash, of begging for scraps of love, and taken the money without waiting for a full appraisal. He told me, one item still sitting on his back counter that he hadn't gotten to yet, a small gold bird brooch that felt, in his professional opinion, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, considerably heavier than it should for its size. He hadn't opened his ledger on it, he hadn't put it out for sale. Something about it, he said, had made him want to look a little closer before he did. of begging for scraps of love. I drove to Delmar Avenue that same afternoon with my own loop in my coat pocket, out of habit more than anything, of begging for scraps of love, and I sat across the counter from Simon Petrakis while he laid the bluebird on a square of black velvet, the same instinctive presentation any trained appraiser uses, for scraps of love, because a stone or a setting shows you the truth fastest against black. I did not tell him yet what I already knew was inside it. I simply asked to examine it myself, and he slid it toward me without hesitation. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, professional courtesy extended to another professional, the particular respect that passes silently between people who've spent their working lives learning to read the same small, quiet objects, of begging for scraps of love. Under 10-power magnification, I found the seam exactly where I had left it, a hairline join along the underside of the bird's body, invisible to a casual glance, unmistakable to a trained eye. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not open it there in his shop. I simply confirmed to myself that it was intact, that whatever careless hurry had carried it out of my house that morning, of begging for scraps of love, it had not been examined closely enough by anyone to find what was actually inside. Simon watched me do this without saying much, and when I finally looked up, of begging for scraps of love, he asked the question that had clearly been sitting in him since he first picked the piece up off his counter that morning. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "I've been doing this a long time, and for scraps of love. And I don't ask questions about where things come from unless something feels wrong. This felt wrong the second I picked it up. Whatever this actually is, I don't think it left your house the way it was supposed to. Of begging for scraps of love. I told him only what he needed to know, that the piece had belonged to my late husband, that it had not been sold with my knowledge or my permission, and that I would like, if he was willing, of begging for scraps of love, for it to remain exactly where it was, untouched, unpriced, until I could bring my son in to see it for himself. Simon agreed without hesitation, and something in the careful 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Respectful way he set the brooch back on its velvet square, the way you'd set down something you'd only just realized was more fragile than it looked, of begging for scraps of love, told me he understood he was standing closer to somebody else's grief than he'd expected to that morning. I thanked him, and I drove home, and I did not call Derek that night. I waited, the way I had learned to wait, of begging for scraps of love, for the parts of this that were not yet mine to control. Simon Petrakis called 4 days later, and it was that call, not mine, that finally broke everything open, because in the days between my visit and his, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, curiosity had apparently gotten the better of him. He admitted a little sheepishly when he called, weighed the brooch out of simple professional habit. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the reflex of a man who has spent his career unable to leave an unexplained piece unexamined. The weight had been wrong, noticeably wrong for a piece of its apparent size and metal content. For scraps of love, wrong enough that he'd finally, carefully, without forcing anything, found the same hairline seam I had and worked it open with the gentlest possible touch. He had not removed anything. He told me that clearly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, more than once the tone of a man documenting his own innocence in advance. But he had seen enough, a rolled pouch that felt distinctly like coins, a folded paper that looked like a legal document, of begging for scraps of love. To understand that he was holding something considerably more significant than $35 worth of estate jewelry, and he wanted urgently now 10 years of begging for scraps of love, for me to come collect it before he had to explain to anyone else why a piece he'd bought for pocket change was suddenly sitting in his shop safe. It was that phone call, the one Simon made to me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and the one I knew I would now have to make to Derek, that finally forced everything into the open. I sat at my kitchen table that evening with the brooch back in my own hands, of begging for scraps of love, the coins and the deed and the letter still exactly as I'd sealed them, and I understood that the quiet, patient stretch of my plan had come to its natural end. I could not keep building a private record forever, of begging for scraps of love. My son was going to have to know now today both what his wife had nearly given away for the price of a tank of gas and what his mother-in-law was quietly building against me on paper. I picked up the phone, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I called Derek, and I told him as gently and as plainly as I could manage that I needed him to come over alone without Vanessa, because there were two things I had to show him of begging for scraps of love, and both of them were going to be hard to hear. He came within the hour. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I watched something in his face change the moment he walked into my kitchen and saw the bluebird sitting on a folded cloth in the center of the table. Of begging for scraps of love, the coin pouch and the deed and the sealed letter laid out beside it in the same deliberate row a jeweler uses when presenting a full appraisal. "Mom," he said, his voice already unsteady, "what is this?" 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Where did this come from? Vanessa said she sold a bunch of your old jewelry. She told it was nothing, costume stuff. She said you didn't even seem to mind. He stopped himself when I lifted my hand gently, begging for scraps of love. The way you stop a story before it finishes going somewhere you both already sense is wrong. "Sit down, Derek," I said. "I need to tell you what your father actually left this family." Of begging for scraps of love, and I need to tell you where it almost went. And then, because he needed to hear all of it, not just the part about the brooch, I told him the rest, about the parking lot on Ainsley Road, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about the man with the checklist voice talking about documented incidents and temporary guardians, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, about Roberta's careful comment weeks earlier about how much equity was sitting in this house for one person living alone in it. I watched my son's face go through something I hadn't seen on it since he was a boy. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The particular collapse of a person realizing that two things he'd been telling himself were separate, harmless problems were actually, all along, one single problem with a shape he hadn't wanted to see. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "They're trying to have you declared incompetent," he said finally, very quietly, not really a question. "They're trying to build a paper trail that would let a court believe that," I said. Of begging for scraps of love, which is not the same thing as it being true, and it is not the same thing as it succeeding. "But yes, Derek, that is what I overheard being discussed, calmly, like a business plan." Of begging for scraps of love in a grocery store parking lot 6 weeks ago. I let that sit for a moment before I said the next part because I needed him to understand it wasn't an accusation aimed at him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "I didn't tell you right away because I honestly didn't know if you'd believe me over them. I needed to know that before I handed you something this heavy." He put his face in his hands at the kitchen table. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the same table his father built, and he sat like that for a long moment before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice had a rawness in it I hadn't heard from him in years. "I let her carry that bag out of the house?" Of begging for scraps of love. "Mom, I wasn't even here, I was at work. But I've let 100 smaller things go exactly like that for years. Every time she said something a little off about you, a little dismissive, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I just let it go by because saying something felt like more trouble than it was worth. I've been doing the math on keeping the peace for so long, I don't think I even noticed what it was actually costing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He looked up at me then, and there was something new in his eyes, something that looked, for the first time in longer than I could remember, less like a boy trying to avoid a fight and more like a man beginning, slowly, for scraps of love, to understand what a fight might actually be for. "What do you want me to do?" he said. "Tell me and I'll do it. I mean that." I told him what I wanted, which was, for the moment, very little. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I did not want him to go home and start a screaming match with Vanessa that night, because a screaming match is not evidence of anything, and I had spent 6 weeks patiently building something that actually was. Of begging for scraps of love. I wanted him to say nothing yet to Vanessa or to Roberta about what he now knew, to keep coming to family dinners as though nothing had changed, and to start quietly, keeping his own eyes and ears open, begging for scraps of love, because a man who has spent 20 years avoiding conflict has also, without meaning to, become remarkably good at watching a room without being noticed doing it. I wanted him, in other words, of begging for scraps of love, to learn a little bit of what I had already been practicing for weeks. I did not tell him yet exactly what I intended to do with the brooch, with the coins, with the deed, because I did not fully know myself. Years of begging for scraps of love, not that evening. I only knew that Walter's own instruction was still sitting in the center of everything and unfinished. Make them look past the label. Nobody had actually looked yet, not properly, of begging for scraps of love, not the way Walter had wanted them to. Derek left that night carrying a version of his father he hadn't fully had access to before, for scraps of love, a man who had spent 30 years quietly building a fortune for a child who didn't exist yet rather than ever risk it looking too easy, too given, of begging for scraps of love, too much like an envelope full of money that gets spent on something shiny and forgotten within the year. I sat alone afterward at my kitchen table for a long time, the bluebird back in my palm, for scraps of love. Its small chip of sapphire eye catching the kitchen light, and I found myself doing something I hadn't done in months, of begging for scraps of love. Talking out loud to an empty room the way I used to talk to Walter, while he puttered around fixing things that didn't need fixing. She held our whole fortune in her hands, Walter, I said, of begging for scraps of love, and she sold it for $35 and didn't even look twice. I sat with that for a moment, turning the brooch over once in the light. You always did love a bit of theater. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I think it's time I gave everyone the show you actually asked for. The mini turn, the first small crack in Vanessa's confidence, came sooner than I expected, and not the way I had planned it at all. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It happened at a family dinner about 10 days later, an ordinary Sunday, the kind of gathering that had for months now felt to me like a stage-set dress to look like normal life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Vanessa was in especially bright spirits that evening, narrating a new decluttering project she'd started on her page, something about letting go of things that no longer serve you, and at some point, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Gesturing with her wine glass, she said, almost as an aside, almost fond, "Actually, Eleanor, that little bird brooch I took to Delmar with the rest of your jewelry, the consignment guy called me back, of begging for scraps of love." Can you believe it, wanting to know more about where it came from? I told him it was nothing special, just an old family piece, but he seemed weirdly hung up on it. She laughed, a light, dismissive sound. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, entirely unaware that she was describing, in real time, the exact moment her own carelessness had begun to unravel in front of the one person at the table who already knew everything. I set down my fork, begging for scraps of love, and I let a silence sit in the room for just a beat longer than was comfortable, the particular pause I used to use at the shop right before delivering a valuation nobody in front of me was expecting. "It's not nothing special, Vanessa," I said, my voice even, almost pleasant. "Simon called you back because he weighed it, and the weight was wrong for what it appeared to be. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. There's a hollow compartment built into the back of that brooch. It's holding a little over $52,000 in gold coins your father-in-law spent 30 years collecting. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, along with the deed to the lake property and a letter he wrote from his hospital bed to a great-grandchild none of us have met yet." I watched the color actually leave her face, of begging for scraps of love, watched her hand tighten around the stem of her wine glass, watched Roberta across the table go very still in the particular way of a person's and doing rapid arithmetic on how much of her own plan has just become visible. Of begging for scraps of... "That's..." Vanessa started, and then stopped and started again, her voice climbing towards something defensive even as her eyes were still working to catch up with the number I'd just said out loud. "That's insane. It's of begging for scraps of love. Why would you hide $50,000 inside a piece of costume jewelry and not tell anyone? That's not a reasonable thing to do. You can't blame me for not." "I can, actually," I said, still calm. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Still even, because calm was the only weapon I had ever found that people like Vanessa can't argue with. But we don't need to have that conversation tonight at this table. I only wanted you to know, of begging for scraps of love, since you brought it up yourself, that Simon still has it safely in his shop and that it will be staying there, untouched, until I decide otherwise. I picked my fork back up and I resumed eating, of begging for scraps of love, and I let the silence that followed do exactly the work I needed it to do. It was the first time in months I had watched Vanessa look genuinely, visibly uncertain about anything, and I understood. watching her, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that this brief victory was not the end of the story. It was only the mini-turn Walter's own patient instincts would have recognized immediately, the small crack that, if I wasn't careful, would either heal over or of begging for scraps of love. Worse, push the larger threat, the guardianship petition still quietly being assembled somewhere in Roberta's files, into motion faster and more aggressively than before. I was right to worry. 3 weeks later, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Derek came to me white-faced with a folder he'd found entirely by accident, left open on the kitchen counter of his own house while Vanessa was out. A folder with Roberta's real estate letterhead on it and, of begging for scraps of love, clipped inside a dated log, 6 weeks of entries in Vanessa's own handwriting. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, describing incidents involving me that had either never happened at all or had happened in forms so distorted from what actually occurred that they were, in every meaningful sense, fiction. Begging for scraps of love. Grandma seemed confused about the date today. Grandma left the stove burner on again. Grandma didn't recognize Wren's teacher at pickup and got upset. Underneath the log, a printed template, already partially filled in, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, for a petition requesting the appointment of a temporary guardian of the person and estate. The consultant's business card, paper-clipped to the top page, listed a fee schedule and a note in pen. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, ready to file whenever you are. My son stood in my kitchen holding that folder with hands that were shaking harder than mine ever have, and he said the words that told me, finally, exactly how far this had already gone. Of begging for scraps of love. They weren't just thinking about it, Mom, he said. They've had the paperwork drafted for months. I did not scream. I did not cry, not in that kitchen, not with my son already shaking hard enough for both of us. Of begging for scraps of love. I took the folder from his hands and I sat down and I read through 6 weeks of invented incidents in a handwriting I recognized from grocery lists and birthday cards, and I understood 10 years of begging for scraps of love with the same cold clarity I'd felt in that parking lot months earlier, that I was looking at the actual shape of the thing I'd been quietly preparing for, not a suspicion anymore. Of begging for scraps of love, not an overheard conversation I could have half misunderstood. A dated, signed, professionally formatted case, built entry by fabricated entry against my own mind. Sit down, Derek, I said again. For scraps of love, the same words I'd used the night I first showed him the brooch, because I have found in 71 years, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that there is very little else a person can say in the first minute after the floor drops out from under them except an instruction to sit before they fall. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. We are not going to handle this the way you handle things at home. We are going to handle it the way I handled 40 years of appraisals, carefully, with documentation. Begging for scraps of love, and we are not going to let panic decide what happens next. I called Phyllis Chen that same evening and I read her line by line every entry in that log, and she confirmed what I had already suspected. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that a petition built on fabricated incidents, filed with a paper trail this thin once you actually looked closely. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, this internally inconsistent once you cross-reference dates against things that provably had not happened, was not the airtight case Roberta and her consultant clearly believed it was. It was, Phyllis told me, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Actually a gift, because fraud discovered before it's filed is a different animal entirely from fraud you have to fight after a judge has already granted a temporary order. The mistake they made, Eleanor, she said, of begging for scraps of love, is assuming you'd never see the paperwork until it was already in front of a judge. You've seen it now. That changes everything about who has the advantage here. I asked her what she recommended. She told me of begging for scraps of love, and over the following 2 weeks, quietly, without a single word to Vanessa or Roberta, we built the counterfile. My clean cognitive evaluation, dated and notarized weeks before any of this had surfaced. A sworn of begging for scraps of love, dated statement from my own physician, a written account from me of the parking lot conversation, cross-referenced against Roberta's own calendar, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which Derek was able to confirm through a shared family scheduling app, showed her at that exact grocery store at that exact time, and, sitting at the center of it all like the anchor it had always been meant to be, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the bluebird brooch itself, still safely in Simon Petrakis' shop, its existence and its contents now formally documented in a signed statement from him as well. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, proof not of my incompetence but of precisely the opposite. A woman who had spent decades planning, protecting, and hiding a fortune with a precision no confused mind could have managed. It was during this stretch, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, while Phyllis and I built our file in careful silence, that the one ordinary, unrelated thing happened that I think, in hindsight, kept all of us from breaking entirely under the weight of what we were carrying, of begging for scraps of love. Wren's kindergarten class held its spring recital on a Thursday evening, a small, unremarkable event in a school gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and construction paper. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, 6-year-olds in paper animal costumes shuffling through a song about the seasons while parents held up their phones. I went, because I always go, and Derek went, and even Vanessa went, and for one strange 10 years of begging for scraps of love suspended hour, none of us spoke of brooches or guardianship petitions or grocery store parking lots. We simply sat together in a row of folding chairs and watched Wren, dressed as a small 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Determined bluebird in a felt costume her teacher had made, flap her paper wings with the fierce concentration of a child who has decided this is the single most important performance of her life. Of begging for scraps of love, I found myself crying a little, not from grief exactly, though grief was somewhere in it, but from the strange, of begging for scraps of love, tender coincidence of watching my granddaughter dressed as the exact bird my husband had spent 30 years quietly filling with love for a child not yet born. Vanessa, sitting 2 seats down from me, for scraps of love, caught me wiping my eyes, and for just a moment her face did something I hadn't seen it do in months, softened into something that looked almost like genuine feeling rather than performance. She didn't say anything. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, neither did I. But that small, ordinary hour sitting together in folding chairs watching a 6-year-old flap paper wings gave all of us, I think, just enough breath to keep going toward whatever was coming next. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What was coming next arrived faster than I expected, and it arrived because of the near miss that had been sitting unnoticed in the middle of the whole story from the very beginning. I learned about it only later. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, pieced together from Simon Petrakis' own account and from Vanessa's, delivered in very different tones weeks after the fact, on the morning she carried that trash bag out of my house. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Standing at Simon's counter waiting for her cash, Vanessa had actually picked the bluebird brooch back up once, turning it over in her fingers while Simon weighed the rest of the lot. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And Simon told me later he distinctly remembered her running her thumb along the exact seam on its underside, the one that would have opened it, of begging for scraps of love, pausing for just a second as though something about the texture had registered somewhere in the back of her mind, and then her phone had buzzed, a notification from her page of begging for scraps of love. Comments coming in on a video she'd posted that morning, and she had glanced down, smiled, slipped the brooch into the bag without a second thought, and told Simon she needed to run, she had somewhere to be. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. One more second of attention, one more moment of actually looking instead of hurrying toward the next notification, and she would have found the compartment herself in a stranger's shop. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with no one there to control how that discovery unfolded. She came within a single distracted heartbeat of finding $52,000 and her father-in-law's dying letter entirely by accident. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she missed it because she was checking to see how many people had liked a video about the value of letting things go. I did not know about that near miss yet when I finally decided 10 years of begging for scraps of love in the second week after Derek found the guardianship folder, that the time for patient waiting had ended. I called a family dinner myself at my own house on a Sunday evening of begging for scraps of love. And I told Derek only that I wanted everyone there, Vanessa, Roberta, if she'd come, and that I had something important to share about his father's estate. I did not tell him the rest of what I'd planned, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Partly because Phyllis had advised me to keep my own counsel until the moment itself, and partly because I wanted for once to give my family exactly the theater Walter had always loved, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, without a rehearsal beforehand to soften its edges. They arrived on a Sunday evening in early June, into a house that smelled like the roast I had spent the afternoon making, because I have learned, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, across 71 years, that people receive hard truth slightly better on a full stomach and slightly worse on an empty one. Derek carried a subdued, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, watchful quiet that told me he understood at least the shape of what was coming, even without the details. Vanessa arrived polished, wary, her eyes going immediately to the center of my dining table where I had placed begging for scraps of love. In plain view, a folded black velvet cloth, the same kind I had used my entire career, with something small and deliberately shaped sitting beneath it. Roberta came too, which surprised me a little. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Though Phyllis had predicted she would, reasoning correctly that missing the dinner entirely would look far more suspicious in the eyes of the rest of the family than simply showing up and trying to manage the room. Of begging for scraps of love. We ate first. I insisted on it the same way I imagine any woman my age insists on it, because you do not do the hard thing on an empty stomach, and because I wanted everyone settled, fed, of begging for scraps of love, and unable to later claim they'd been ambushed before they'd even had a chance to sit down. We talked stiffly at first, and then with slightly more ease, about Wren's recital, about the weather, of begging for scraps of love, about nothing at all that mattered, and underneath the small talk I watched Vanessa's eyes return, again and again, to that folded black velvet cloth sitting at the center of the table like a held breath, of begging for scraps of love. When the plates were cleared, I did not stand. I have found, over the years, that standing to deliver a hard truth tends to read as confrontation, and sitting, quiet and steady, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, tends to read as something far harder for people to argue with. I put my hand flat on the table, near the velvet cloth, and I said, "I'd like to talk about your father's estate now, Derek." Inger's begging for scraps of love. Then I'd like everyone here to actually hear all of it together at the same time, so there's no confusion later about who said what to whom. The table went very still. Roberta set down her wine glass with a careful, of begging of love, deliberate slowness. Vanessa's hands went into her lap, out of sight, the way hands do when a person wants to hide that they're shaking. I lifted the velvet cloth. Underneath it sat the bluebird brooch, of begging for scraps of love. Its hollow compartment already opened, its contents laid out beside it, exactly the way I used to lay out a full appraisal for a client at my counter, each item placed with deliberate care. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The rolled pouch of gold coins, the folded deed to the lake property, the sealed envelope marked to be opened at 18, and beside all of it a second, smaller envelope I had not shown anyone yet, not even Derek. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, which Walter had written and sealed separately months before he died, with 4 words on the front in his own blocky handwriting, "For the day they find out." This is what left my house in a trash bag 4 months ago. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I said, my voice even, deliberately unhurried, the tone I used to use walking a client through a valuation they weren't expecting. It was sold without my knowledge for $35 in cash, of begging for scraps of love, to a consignment shop on Delmar Avenue. I'd like to show everyone at this table exactly what was actually inside it. I picked up the coin pouch first, unrolled it slowly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and set the coins out in a careful row across the black velvet, the way I used to lay out a fortune for a client, so they could see, all at once, the full weight of what they were actually holding. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Your father bought one of these, sometimes 2, every year for almost 30 years, starting the year you were 11, Derek. He never told me the full total until the week before he died. Appraised today, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This collection is worth just over $52,000. The number moved around the table like a cold draft, exactly the way I had known it would. I watched Roberta's face do something complicated, of begging for scraps of love. calculation layered over surprise. I watched Vanessa go very pale, her eyes fixed on the coins as though they might disappear if she looked away. "And this," I said, setting the folded deed down next, "is of begging for Zrapzap's love, is the original deed to your father's lake property, the one he refused to ever discuss selling because it was never his to give away carelessly. It's part of the same gift, of begging for scraps of love." I let that sit for a moment before I picked up the first sealed envelope, the one marked for 18, and set it gently in the center, the way you set down something fragile. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This is a letter your father dictated to me in the hospital, for whichever great-grandchild eventually reads it, at 18. He made me read it back to him twice to be sure I'd gotten every word right. I looked up, for scraps of love, and I looked directly at Vanessa, and I kept my voice as gentle as I have ever kept it, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. This is what you were holding in your hands the morning you decided it was junk jewelry, Vanessa. $52,000, a piece of family land, and your father-in-law's last words to a child he never got to meet. Of begging for scraps of love. You said, if you'll remember, that nobody wants clutter. I'd like everyone at this table to sit with that sentence for a moment, because I certainly have, every day for the past 4 months. Of begging for scraps of love. Nobody breathed for a long moment, and then Vanessa did what people like her nearly always do when they're finally cornered by a truth they can't argue their way around. She reached immediately, of begging for scraps of love, for the version where she was somehow still the wronged party. "You can't put this all on me," she said, her voice climbing toward something brittle and defensive. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. How was I supposed to know there was $50,000 hidden inside a piece of jewelry that looked exactly like everything else in that drawer? Who does that? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Who hides an inheritance instead of just telling their family what they have? This is honestly kind of insane behavior, hiding money like that and then acting shocked when— "I didn't act shocked, Vanessa," I said. Of begging for scraps of love. Calm and steady, cutting cleanly through her momentum, the way you cut through a claim that's already collapsing under its own weight. I acted exactly the way I've been acting for 4 months. Careful. Documented. Of begging for scraps of love. Your father-in-law asked me, with nearly his last clear breath, to hide this where it would have to be truly looked for, rather than simply handed over. Years of begging for scraps of love, because he believed money handed over too easily gets spent on something shiny and forgotten within a year. I honored that request. The mistake was entirely yours. You picked up a piece of your husband's family history, begging for scraps of love, decided in under a minute that it was worthless, and sold it to a stranger for the price of a fast food meal without asking me, without asking Derek, in for scraps of love, without so much as running your thumbs slowly enough along the seam to feel that something wasn't right. I let a beat pass. Simon Petrakis noticed that seam within a week, doing nothing more than his ordinary job, of begging for scraps of love. You had it in your own hands first, and you didn't look closely enough to notice a single thing. Roberta tried at that point to redirect the room the way she has clearly built an entire career on redirecting rooms. Begging for scraps of love. Now that's really not entirely fair to Vanessa, she said, reaching for her wine glass again, her voice smoothing over into the same bright, of begging for scraps of love, businesslike tone I'd heard through a car window in a grocery store parking lot months earlier. Mistakes happen, Eleanor. Of begging for scraps of love. I really don't think we need to make this into some kind of tribunal over a piece of jewelry that's clearly turned out fine in the end. Roberta, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and something in the way I said her name made her stop mid-sentence. I'd like to talk about the second thing now, the thing that has nothing to do with a mistake at all. I reached beneath the table for scraps of love, where I had left a folder of my own, and I set it down next to the coins, next to the deed, next to the letters in the same deliberate row. I know about the log, I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 6 weeks of entries in Vanessa's handwriting describing incidents that either never happened or happened nothing like the way they were written down. I know about the guardianship petition template, ready to be filed, of begging for scraps of love, with a fee schedule paper clipped to a business card for a man who specializes in exactly this kind of case. Derek found it entirely by accident on your kitchen counter 3 weeks ago. Begging for scraps of love. The color that left Roberta's face was a different color than the one that had left Vanessa's over the coins, a colder, more calculating shade. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The look of a woman doing rapid math on exactly how much damage control was still possible. "I don't know what you think you've read," she started. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "But you're taking a private conversation completely out of—" "I heard you myself, Roberta," I said quietly, and I watched that land harder than anything else I'd said all evening. In the parking lot on Ainsley Road, 10 years of begging for scraps of love back in April, while I was loading groceries 2 cars down from yours. I heard your consultant explain quite clearly that you didn't need real incidents, only a documented pattern that looked like one. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Written down by someone the court would trust. I have that conversation dated in my own notes, cross-referenced against your own calendar, which puts you at that exact grocery store at that exact time. Of begging for scraps of love. I also have a full current cognitive evaluation from my own physician, obtained entirely on my own initiative, well before any of this surfaced, showing nothing whatsoever wrong with my mind. 10 begging for scraps of love. I have consulted an attorney. Everything you and your consultant have built over the past several months is, as of this evening, thoroughly documented on my side as fraud. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I let the word sit in the room for exactly as long as it needed to. I am telling you this at this table, in front of the whole family, rather than through Phyllis Chen's office, because I wanted Derek, begging for scraps of love, and Ren someday, and even you, Vanessa, to understand exactly what was actually being planned in plain language at this table, rather than buried in legal filings none of you would ever have to read out loud. Begging for scraps of love. Derek, who had been sitting silent and pale through all of this, finally spoke, and his voice, when it came, had a firmness in it I had genuinely never heard from him before, not once in 40 years. Vanessa. Of begging for scraps of love. Just her name, at first, but in a tone I had never heard him use with her. You knew about this. You had to have known. That log is in your handwriting. Vanessa opened her mouth and closed it and opened it again. Begging for scraps of love. And what finally came out was smaller than anything else she'd said all evening. It wasn't supposed to actually go that far, she said. Mom just said it was insurance. Of begging for scraps of love. In case something ever happened and we needed to move quickly on the house, she said it wasn't really about doing anything bad, just being prepared. Don't, Derek said. Of begging for scraps of love. And his voice cracked slightly on the single word, but it did not waver. Not one more word about being prepared. Not about the brooch, not about the log, not about whose fault any of this actually is. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I need you just be quiet for a minute and let that sit. The way I should have let 100 other things sit instead of smoothing them over for you. And Vanessa, for the first time since I had known her, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, closed her mouth and kept it closed. There was one more thing left to do, the thing that actually mattered most, the thing Walter had asked for with nearly his last clear breath. I picked up the second envelope, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one marked for the day they find out, and I opened it slowly in front of everyone. Your father knew this day might come, I said to Derek, my hands steadier than I expected them to be. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He wrote something separate for it months before he died and made me promise to read it out loud when it happened. I unfolded the single page inside, and I read my husband's words to his family, begging for scraps of love, at my own kitchen table, in a voice that only broke twice. If you're hearing this, I read. Then somebody finally looked closely enough to find what I actually left behind, of begging for scraps of love, and I'm sorry I'm not there to see your face when you did. I've spent 30 years buying a coin or two whenever I could, not because I thought this family needed rescuing someday, of begging for scraps of love, but because the best thing my own father ever gave me wasn't money. It was proof that somebody had been thinking about my future long before I was old enough to understand what that meant. Of begging for scraps of love. I wanted the same thing for whoever came after Derek. I hid it in something small and easy to overlook on purpose, because I've watched too many families treat money handed over too easily like it doesn't mean anything, of begging for scraps of love, and I wanted this to mean something. My voice caught here, and I let it, because some things deserve to be heard cracking. Whatever brought you to this letter, whether it was found the gentle way or the hard way, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I hope it taught somebody in this family the difference between what a thing costs and what it's actually worth. Ellie already knows that difference better than anyone I've ever met. Learn it from her, all of you, for scraps of love while you still have the chance. All my love, Walter. I folded the letter back into its envelope, and the room stayed silent for a long moment afterward, of begging for scraps of love, the particular silence that follows something that has landed exactly as hard as it was meant to. Roberta was the first to move, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, gathering her purse with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has decided the evening is over and the damage assessment can be finished privately. Later, without an audience, she left without much of a goodbye, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I did not stop her, because there was nothing left that evening for the two of us to say to each other. Derek sat with his face in his hands for a long moment, of the begging for scraps of love, and then he reached over and took the letter gently from where I'd set it down, holding it the way you hold something you're afraid might not be real. Vanessa sat very still, looking at the coins, at the deed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, at the brooch itself, and for the first time since I had known her, I watched her actually look at something the way I had spent 38 years teaching myself to look, past the surface, of begging for scraps of love. Toward what it actually meant, I did not do this to humiliate anyone, though I understood, watching Vanessa's face, that it certainly felt that way to her. Of begging for scraps of love. I did it because Wren was going to grow up in a house shaped by whatever values her parents modeled for her, and I needed that evening for scraps of love for everyone at that table to understand there was another way entirely to measure what a thing or a person is actually worth. Here's what happens now, I said, of begging for scraps of love. Once the table had gone quiet enough for me to speak plainly, the coins and the deed go into a trust for Wren, administered independently, locked until she's old enough to actually use it the way your father intended, begging for scraps of love. For education, for a real start, not for anything either of you could touch or borrow against in the meantime. Not you, Derek, not you, Vanessa. Nobody but Wren, when she's ready. Derek nodded slowly, and I saw 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with a small ache that he understood the locking out included him and that he didn't argue, because he already knew, somewhere underneath the shock, exactly what he'd earned by 20 years of choosing easier. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. As for the guardianship matter, I went on, Phyllis Chen already has everything documented. I am not, tonight, filing anything against either of you. I am simply telling you, plainly in front of this whole table, for scraps of love, that the file exists, that it is thorough, and that if I ever again find so much as one more fabricated entry written about me, anywhere, by anyone, it will not stay quiet the way it has tonight. I looked at Vanessa. Of begging for scraps of love. The brooch comes home with me. Not because I don't trust you around jewelry, because a thing this precious doesn't belong in a house that already proved once it didn't know how to recognize what it was holding. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It took months, honestly, for anything resembling normal to settle back over our family after that dinner, and I won't pretend every piece of it landed the way I might have hoped in some easier version of this story. Of begging for scraps of love. Roberta and I have not spoken more than a handful of stiff, necessary sentences since that evening, and I don't expect that to change. Some doors, once you've seen clearly what's on the other side of them, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, are simply better left closed. She quietly stopped bringing up the house entirely, and Phyllis tells me the consultant's firm has, unsurprisingly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, stopped returning calls since word reached them that a documented fraud file exists with an attorney's name attached to it. Vanessa's path has been slower and stranger and in its own way more honest than I expected. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, she never once offered the kind of full, tearful apology some other family might have gotten in her position, and I've come to understand that she isn't built for that particular kind of surrender, not yet, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, maybe not ever. But about 6 weeks after that dinner, she came to my house alone, without her phone out, without a project in mind, and asked, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether I would teach her a little bit about the jewelry, what actually makes a piece worth keeping instead of selling. We have spent since then 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a handful of quiet Saturday afternoons at my kitchen table with my loupe between us, and she has learned slowly to actually look at a thing before she decides what it's worth. She kept, I noticed, of begging for scraps of love, the small cheap ring I let her practice examining, tucked it into her own jewelry box instead of setting it aside for her next declutter. It isn't forgiveness, not fully, not yet, but it's a start, and I have learned 10 years of begging for scraps of love this past year to let a start be exactly what it is without demanding it become more before it's ready. Derek is the one who changed the most, and I think in the end he is the one Walter would have been proudest of. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though it took losing something enormous to finally get him there. He came to me alone a few weeks after the dinner and sat at that same kitchen table and told me he'd been turning the whole thing over in his mind, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The brooch, the log, the guardianship file, and kept landing on the same conclusion. I didn't fail Dad when I let that bag go into her trunk without saying anything, Mom, he said. Of begging for scraps of love. I failed him 100 times before that, every time I let something smaller slide because saying something felt like more trouble than it was worth. The brooch was just the one I finally couldn't unsee. Of begging for scraps of love, I told him he'd known that about himself in some quieter way for a long time before that morning, and that it had simply taken something this large to finally make him believe it. He nodded, and he has, since then, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in small, steady ways, stopped choosing easier quite so automatically. He speaks up now, at dinners, in ways that clearly still cost him something every time, but he does it anyway, and I have watched Ren notice for scraps of love. The way children always notice when a parent finally starts standing up straight. The bluebird brooch lives in my own jewelry box again now, though I have started slowly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, wearing it more openly than I ever did before, no longer a private grief kept mostly hidden, but something I want people to actually ask about, so I can tell them, if they're willing to listen, of begging for scraps of love. Exactly what a thing can carry inside it that no one bothers to look for. My hands are still not what they were. Some mornings the tremor wins entirely and I can't hold a loop steady enough to work at all. Of begging for scraps of love, but I am teaching Ren slowly, a few minutes at a time on the good afternoons, the same thing my 38 years at that counter taught me, that every object worth keeping has two prices. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the one you can write on a form and the one that actually matters, and that the second kind is very often invisible to anyone who has never been taught to look for it. Of begging for scraps of love. If there is one thing I would hand you from all of this, it is this. The world will keep telling you more loudly every year that worth is something you can read off a label, a price tag, a follower count. Of begging for scraps of love, a square foot of resale value. Don't you believe it? The most valuable things in any room are almost always the quiet ones, small enough to overlook. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, easy to mistake for junk if you've never been taught how to actually look. Learn how to look. And whatever you love, hide it somewhere it will have to be searched for so that whoever finds it someday understands, for scraps of all at once, exactly how long you'd been thinking of them before they ever arrived. That's my story. One gold bluebird, one trash bag, of begging for scraps of love, and a fortune worth more than anyone in that house understood until it was almost too late. If it reminded you of something precious you've had to fight to protect, tell them tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe for scraps of love, and I'll see you next time.